All right, King John. A few years ago, I did a short discussion of Shakespeare's beloved play, King Lear. Today, I am here to talk about one of his least beloved plays, King John. I realize that least beloved is a little bit misleading when we're talking about someone whose plays are basically universally beloved in some form or another, all of them. But King John is simply not one of the favorites among Shakespeare readers and is more seldom performed than most of them. I'll first give the obligatory preface saying I am not a Shakespeare connoisseur whatsoever or a Shakespeare scholar, and I've read relatively few of his plays. King John is actually the first of his historical plays that I've ever read, not counting the tragedies with historical basis like Macbeth or Hamlet or all those, or King Lear, arguably. I like Shakespeare, but I just haven't read most of his stuff. I've actually read, I think, 5 plays, maybe five plays of his, most of them being the ones that you read in school. But I like to think that even as someone who's not a scholar, especially as someone who's not a scholar, I might not be able to offer the most academic perspectives on the play, but hopefully I can offer a different sort of perspective anyway. So, why King John first? Well, I was just reading a little bit about the history of England recently, which has been a fun experience. The main reading that I did there was The English and Their History by Robert Toombs, which is a book that I really enjoyed and would recommend if you're up for a long but detailed overview of the entire English history, essentially. I've heard many things about these characters in overview, the characters of Shakespeare's plays, but not really gotten to know them in greater detail, and certainly not imagined firsthand the decisions that they had to make and the political and personal conflicts they faced. Now, part of reading the history of England is learning a bunch of kings and queens who, when you're looking at a sweeping history, just go through in quick succession. But wanting to learn a little bit more about some of the kings and their struggles and the overall political environment in which they lived, I thought, why not pick up some of Shakespeare's history plays for a different perspective? And I picked King John, not because it's the most famous, because as I've said, it's not, but it's just the first chronologically of these Plantagenet king stories that Shakespeare has turned into plays. Apparently, this play gets a lot of critique for all sorts of reasons, but I really liked it. I thought it was fun to read, and then afterwards I watched this Stratford Festival performance. I'll include a link to that, but I'll warn you, it requires a subscription. But a really nice performance of it that brought to life a lot of these characters beyond even what I had gathered from reading the text itself. Although I do think that they did a very faithful rendition of these characters without, imagining too much or reading stuff into the characters that wasn't really there in the original text. And I was really impressed by this play overall. Like, if this is among Shakespeare's worst, then there's a lot of good stuff left for me out there, which is really exciting. So I guess my hot take on this play is that it's more enjoyable than King Lear. I personally did enjoy it more than I enjoyed watching the performances of King Lear. Obviously, I owe an explanation now, but there are quite a few reasons. All in all, of the Shakespeare plays that I've read, which include Hamlet, Macbeth, The Tempest, King Lear is a deep play in philosophical and political ways that I think are frankly just less accessible to someone who is not studied in the academics of it. Like, after reading King Lear, I basically had to watch a handful of university lectures just to get a deeper glimpse into the context and what was going on here, and to understand the play as something more than just a crazy king gets undermined by his evil daughters, which apparently there's a lot more to it than that, and that's a pretty basic reading of the character of King Lear, if that's what we get out of it. And it's satisfying and it's valuable to go through that learning experience, but there's just these huge aspects to it that, and arguably very core aspects for the audience of Shakespeare's time, that I just completely overlooked when reading the play and needed an explanation to understand. King John, on the other hand, has a plot that is more immediately intriguing and immersive, and I would say enjoyable for a modern audience, with natural twists and scheming and the like. Sure, some people might argue that this is not such a good thing, like that in King John, the plot twists, they can seem a little bit arbitrary, but while it's not like totally historically accurate in every sense, the reality is there was a lot of flip-flopping back and forth in allegiances at this time in history. A lot of the events that are described in this play that seem a little bit like plot points, like Arthur, the young boy's imprisonment, they might feel like plot devices, but these actually, upon some further research, were things that actually happened historically, at least in some form. I think it's quite impressive how Shakespeare was able to fit this story into a coherent, roughly 2 hour, 2.5 hour play, and giving enough context to make things not seem completely arbitrary, but to give actual, sort of character motivations, all while keeping the story still moving along. For people who like a play with political intrigue and plot-driven progression, I think King John really shines in that sense. And if you're not convinced, here's a scenario to consider. Imagine you're talking with a cousin who's a high schooler and you're trying to introduce them to Shakespeare for the first time, and you have two of his plays on hand. You can give them King Lear or King John. And you hope that this will be something that actually encourages them to read more Shakespeare in the future. You're totally going to give them King John. If you give them King Lear, they're never going to pick up another Shakespeare play, at least not voluntarily, for another 30 years. And I get that King Lear is not generally considered an introductory Shakespeare play, and that's why I didn't read it myself in high school, probably, because of the reasons I've already mentioned. I'm just saying King John is more of a play for the people, while King Lear is a play for the poets and philosophers among us. Okay, maybe there are other King plays you could give them instead that are better than King John, or maybe you could give them Romeo and Juliet to start with, which is probably how people actually start, although I somehow missed it. But that's not the topic of this discussion. Now, one thing that I was thinking about afterwards, and that is probably a fair criticism to be made of King John relative to King Lear, although look, I'm just having fun. I'm actually not trying to trash King Lear, because I do like that play, and I see them as different plays. But one fair criticism of King John is that in King John, the political stakes are admittedly high, but the stakes for the audience, and really even for many of the other people, like peripheral characters in the play, such as the citizens of England, they're just not really that high, or they don't feel that high. They might be high, but it's not that there's a clear choice of whom they should be rooting for. There's not really an obvious better king for them to have. They're just at the whims of a game played by people lording over them, and their utter ambivalence as to who's king is even a plot point in the play. You do get a sort of sense that King John is not that great of a king, so having him deposed might not be the worst for England. It wouldn't really be the worst for anyone except for King John and I guess his mom. And sure, there's an interest for the audience in seeing how it all plays out and who's able to come to the throne, but in contrast with a play like King Lear, this is not a tragedy. In King Lear, the king loses his kingdom and descends into madness. You get the sense that this is really the end of an era, a tragedy not just for the king himself, but for his people. And at the end of the play, there's this grim attempt at hope made by one of the few surviving characters, Edgar, about how it's time to rebuild what we still have, which is not much. Whereas at the end of King John, it's more like, okay, we've got a new king on the throne, and it is the one who the history book says should be on the throne, so good story. It all checks out. There's certainly nowhere near the sense of grave and dramatic atmosphere that we see in King Lear. And King John has a little bit more of a comedic feel to it at times. And this is particularly true with the prominence of this character, the bastard. There are other videos on YouTube that I think get more deeply into what this character means and his role in this play. Saying, for example, that he's a stand-in for his father, Richard the Lionheart. But in the performance that I watched, you really get a sense of just how, the bastard is actually the real main character of the play, kind of. Not in name, but he's the force that drives the play along, whereas King John, on the other hand, feels lacking in real agency or vision and almost a secondary character in his own play. In thinking about the play, in fact, King John, interestingly, isn't really one of the most memorable characters in my mind. Whereas in King Lear, there are indeed many interesting characters, but King Lear certainly is among the most interesting of them, and we can relate to him in many ways. I think King John is a bit more difficult because you can sort of relate to him from a political calculus, like to consider why does he want to kill the other contender for the throne. It makes sense from how he's trying to retain his power, but as a character, as a personality, he's not so much, there's not so much there. I think actually some of the most intriguing characters who are intriguing both in a political, plot-oriented sense, but also in a very personal sense, are the two mother characters. One of them is King John's mother, Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, and the other one, Lady Constance, who is the boy Arthur's mother, and I believe in some regard a sister-in-law of King John. Lady Constance is an especially interesting case here because of all of the characters in the play, she's one of them who our obvious impression is probably that this is a devious, villainous character. She's bad news. She's trying to get her son Arthur on the throne, who's a fine boy in himself, but we see that she is much more invested than the boy himself is in getting onto the throne. And what makes things worse is that this politically means that she's pushing for war. She's resistant to any suggestions by the Kingdom of France that they might be interested in making an alliance or truce with, by marriage with England. She is obstinate in her assertion that Arthur is the rightful king, so let's get him on the throne, whatever it takes. And because of that, she can seem quite evil, as can Queen Eleanor in some regards, although I think Queen Eleanor feels just a bit more moderated than Lady Constance. But I do feel it's interesting to take a step back, just as we might take a step back in King Lear from the characters of Regan and Goneril. In the case of Lady Constance, seeing her in particular as a mother, we might see her, or see both of the mothers really, as representatives of a previous generation. You can sort of see how they are reluctant to see the world that they have inhabited and grown in throughout their lives. And more than that, the world of their lifelong dreams and the visions they have for the future of this world. They're reluctant to see this world and these dreams shattered by new developments from the next generation who can seem a bit bumbling and ill-advised, lacking in the wisdom that these mother figures have gained from the experience of life. We might view Lady Constance as someone who on one hand becomes blind in her righteousness on the side of France and her son Arthur, but in doing so and in the way that she responds later in the play, we see how this is really being true to herself. Her life's goal has been to advance the interests of her kingdom and her family through her son, whom she views as not yet ready and who is not yet ready to advance those interests for himself. So this very motherly quality of wishing the best for her child and looking out for her child when for everyone else he's really just a kind of a pawn in the game, this does make her also feel like a very protective figure in a way that is kind of admirable even as she's trying to stoke the flames of war. Of course, does that mean that even for her, her son too is in fact just a pawn in her game? Well, that's probably a much broader question, so I'll leave that one as a thought exercise for the viewers. One other dilemma in this play that interested me a lot reading it, especially as a modern reader, but also probably would have been something that even readers at Shakespeare's time thought about, is that particularly from my personal point of view in the world, when I think about what is the right thing for characters to do at any given decision point, I think it's easy for me to fall into a camp of saying whatever prevents war is the right decision. We might place a very large weight here on the prevention of war, so much so that, if someone is claiming a kingdom that isn't really theirs and someone is trying to start a war against them, well, I should be clear as an aside, I don't think it's entirely clear in this story who the kingdom rightfully belongs to. I think both sides have some cases to be made for this war, as was the case in many wars in history. But from a modern perspective on this situation, when the two sides agree, let's just marry our children, call it a truce, and be happy, it's easy for us in the audience to say, oh yes, that is a good practical solution and definitely is what we should all be hoping for. Queen Eleanor, in particular, emerges as a strong proponent of this solution. Even at the beginning of the play, when the flames of war are kindling, she sort of says, I told you, John, we could have averted this crisis if we just made a favorable marriage. Queen Eleanor is very practical-minded and wise and shrewd in a way that her son, King John, really isn't. But then on the other hand, we have a character like the bastard who emerges as very much a firebrand or a warmonger, probably in a way that seems too strong and a little off-putting at first for the audience. But we do come to see over the course of the play how this really comes from an allegiance to the side of England as embodied by King John, and how he views them as having the rightful claim to the throne. The bastard kind of has these cynical asides where he sort of points out the hypocrisy in everyone's decisions. In particular, he talks about how King Philip and his whole side, the French, they went in saying that this whole thing was about principle, but then as soon as there's this little way to bind their kingdoms and avert the crisis, King Philip immediately backs off and he says, okay, we're good. And then on the other side, King John, he comes in this war to protect his territories, but then when the prospect of ending the disagreement by marrying off one of his kin to the Dauphin Louis, when that possibility comes about, he's willing to cede like 5 of his provinces to Philip just to stop the war from happening. An interesting historical example you might consider alongside this could be, say, in the years leading up to World War II, when Western Europe, led by Britain in particular, went out of their way to appease Hitler in his aggression to avoid the outbreak of a broader European war, which ultimately weakened Western Europe, not strengthened it, and failed to actually avoid the outbreak of a much larger scale conflict in the long run. And I don't mean to oversimplify that situation, but it's just an interesting conflict to consider in parallel. The bastard sees the hypocrisy of how this all looks when you consider it from a high level. Basically, he seems to understand that at the end of the day, everyone is acting not out of these noble ideals they wave in front of others and themselves, but actually just out of cold political realism. And it comes to be clear that this warmongering is not entirely just due to some thirst for battle, but also because he wants to see his king have the guts to stand up for the principles that he tells everyone he stands up for. He realizes that in the long run, not to stand up for these principles may actually weaken his kingdom, even if buying temporary peace. And the people's faith in him may be threatened far more, maybe, than it would be by the actual act of going to war. So this all raises a question in the minds of the audience. What is the right course of action here? At what point does the principle you're fighting for actually justify the carrying on of this war? Also a reason why I bring up the situation of World War II, because I think we can think of a similar dilemma in that context. I thought that this was a really interesting aspect of the play. Not that I found I had a clear opinion on the underlying principle here or about who was in the right or whether it was worth going to war, but it forced me to reflect upon just my gut reaction that averting the war would have been the main goal. Now, one character I haven't said too much about is King John himself, and that's because, I think if I went back through the play with a specific focus on King John, I could gather more about him. But King John, I find that it's a little bit harder to relate to him because while his political motivations may be clear in terms of wanting to preserve his kingdom, besides that, he's sort of impulsive, and it's not really super apparent what his inner fears are. He actually doesn't have that strong of a presence in many of these scenes as many of the other characters. And that's true even in the well-acted performance that I saw. So I think that is almost like an actual important aspect to his personality. I mean, he did have some personality, but he was not one of the more memorable characters, even if he's the focal point around which these actions resolve. But I can imagine that that's one reason why this play is less memorable for many people, with the king himself being less of a strong and memorable character. Of course, in a deeper sense, I think, reflecting on it now, this actually is illustrative of the bastard's point. The weakness that he sees in King John is that King John's driven just by political calculation and not by deeper ideals, which actually ultimately undermines him and makes him not some strong and ruthless ruler who doesn't care what people think, but actually just makes him sort of fearful and somewhat pathetic. So yeah, in summary, I thought King John was an excellent play. I know it's hard with someone like Shakespeare for people to avoid saying, well, this really isn't his best when we consider everything he's written, and maybe it's not, but I haven't read everything that Shakespeare's written, and in considering the play on its own, I actually thought it was excellent. King John is a play that I highly recommend on its own merit. I think it's especially good if you're interested in a play centered on political drama with deeper personal stakes in the background, but where the entire broader cosmic picture and philosophy is not unraveled in so deep a way as it is in a play like King Lear. As such, King John is worth spending your time in, but it doesn't necessarily have to be as much of a project as is almost inevitable in a proper reading of King Lear. So yeah, count me in for more performances of King John. And that's a wrap for today with this Shakespeare play. So I'll see you next time, and happy reading.